these things with the mic, so don't expect too much. But oh, this is what I can do with the mic. I got cold. Okay, so my name is Paul, and I make my living by telling stories. Usually, I sometimes go and tell them in front of the crowd. Sometimes I write. I wrote 3 books. But most of the time, I help my customers tell their stories. I own a brand building company, and I strongly believe that a strong brand is a story well told. But today, I wanted to share another story with you. A story about a team building, team dynamics, that's called a stab in the back. So first, every good story needs a hero, needs a guide. So let me introduce you to our guide. Do you know who this man is? Well, you should. I'm sure you know a company he's created. This company is called Microsoft. He's the founder of Microsoft. But when you think of Microsoft founders, you think of Bill Gates. You've probably heard about Steve Ballmer, but you've never heard about Paul Allen. And I'll tell you why. Back in 1992, it was early days for Microsoft, Paul Allen was diagnosed with cancer. And he committed much of his time to fighting his disease, fighting for his life. And this was exactly the time when Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates plotted against him. They diluted his shares and effectively kicked him out of his own company. This is what they did. Okay, let's have the next team. Do you recognize any of those people? They are 4 founders of Twitter. The one in the upper left corner is Noah Glass. Then there's Eve Williams, Jack Dorsey, and Biz Stone. When Twitter started, back in 2005, it was named differently, and it did a completely different thing. These people collected money from the investors to do something completely different. Back in the day, Twitter was called Audio, and it was supposed to be a podcast aggregating platform. Podcasts were booming back in 2004, 2005, and Audio promised a single place on the web to gather all the podcasts and search and everything. But before they launched their business, Apple opened the iTunes Store. It was also in 2005. And one of the features of the iTunes Store was podcast aggregator. Apple killed their business before they had launched. So they were terrified because they had collected money from the investors. So Noah Glass, the one in the upper left corner, came to the rest of the team and said, hey guys, I've got this side project called Status. Do you remember these situations at work when everybody's tapping on your shoulder and he's asking you, what are you doing now? How about we allow people, just post it once, whoever is interested may be observing this, and we can communicate that way. I even have a name for it because this status should be short, 140 characters at max. So let's call it Twitter because it's like, tweeting of a bird. This guy invented Twitter. He saved the rest of the assets and year after was kicked out of his own company. He no longer works with Twitter. I'm sure you know the guy on the left. Who are the guys on the right? Yeah, the Winklevoss brothers. The guy on the left, for those of you who don't know who he is Mark Zuckerberg. He's the creator of Facebook, or is he? Because these 2 guys, they came up with the idea for Facebook. They gave Mark Zuckerberg the money to code Facebook. They gave him computer servers, and then he kicked them out of their own idea. It wasn't even a company yet, but he kicked them out. These 2 fellas. One of them is called Evan Spiegel. The one on the left is Reggie Brown. They were roommates at college. when they founded Snapchat together. But I think you know where I'm going with that. Reggie Brown is no longer within the company. Evan Spiegel kicked him out, and there's a, well, they are battling in court right now. And we cannot speak about this dynamic without mentioning this team. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Back in the early days of Apple, they received their first payment for the job from Atari, $3,000. Steve Jobs split the money evenly between two partners. Steve Wozniak got $350. Why didn't he mind? Well, because he didn't care. He didn't know how much money they made. But there's an irony to this team. Because in April 1983, 8th of April 1983, this team was joined by the man in the middle, John Scully. He was former head of marketing for PepsiCo. In Steve Jobs' biography, there's this famous conversation when Steve Jobs recruits him for Apple. He says, I don't think you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, right? So John Scully joined Apple, and the irony is he was the one who kicked out Steve Jobs out of his own company. So this team dynamic I am showing you is very, very common. These are the famous teams from the Silicon Valley, but this dynamic happens every day in every team. It's so common, it has its own name. It's named a stab in the back. And where does this name come from? Well, from one of the first guys who did politics or team building like that. His name was Julius Caesar. Back in his days, this was called the triumvirate. He plotted with two guys against other guys, and then he betrayed them, and then he would, plot with another one, until he himself got stabbed in the back by Brutus. In memory of this event, we can now buy a knife holder, Julius Caesar knife holder. And why is this dynamic happening? Well, the answer is not a simple one, but I will try to explain. But first, let me introduce you to yet another story. You are young, so you probably don't remember that, but let me tell you about the Soviet space missions. Because there's one thing you need to know about the Soviet space missions. Back in the 50s and the 60s, the Soviets were kicking Americans' ass when it comes to conquering the space. Soviets were the first to launch an unmanned satellite into space. It was named Sputnik. Soviets were the first to launch a man into space. His name was Yuri Gagarin. What was the name of the first American in space? Nope. Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon. But the name of the first American in space, nobody knows, nobody cares. His name is Shepard, in case you were wondering. But that's not the point. Because Russians were first at many things, they got defeated by something they didn't know. Because when it comes to ignorance, we have two levels of ignorance. There are things we know we don't know, so we can prepare for them. The Soviets suspected some malfunctions, engineering failures, so they could provide their astronauts with spare parts and so on and so on. But two of the Soviet space missions ended before completing all the tasks. So they basically failed because of something they didn't know. Two of the Soviet space missions failed because of the conflict of characters on the spaceship. So these astronauts, they fought one another. They couldn't agree in stressful conditions. They even did as much as threat one another. So one astronaut to the other said, I'm not going to stand another 20 hours with you on this rocket. I'm going to kill you with French wrench or whatever I have. And the space control treated these threats so seriously that they brought down two missions. Americans who eavesdropped at that time. I mean, I don't know why I said that at that time. They are eavesdropping on the way, right? They said, okay, this is something we can prepare for. So NASA hired teams of psychologists with 2 tasks in mind. They were hired to first develop psychological profiles of the astronauts, and then compatibility tables. So who can work and communicate with whom, and so on and so on. So this is what I'm going to talk about, character incompatibility. But let me draw your attention to one team of NASA scientists. Because NASA had many teams. One scientist, one psychologist, Dr. Taibi Kaler, approached this problem from a very different point of view. Because all the other teams said, okay, we have to take a psychological test in order to be evaluated. But Kaler said, okay, no astronaut has to take any test. We have to talk to them because your psychological traits come out in something called speech patterns. So the way you speak allows me to determine which personality type you have, and so on and so on. But before that, let me tell you about another discovery of Kaler's, the basic roles that we assume when we are joining a team. There are 6 basic roles, and each of you has innate role that they take in a team. You can be either a harmonizer. A harmonizer is a person who is most concerned about the well-being of other team members. So when getting to a goal requires you to yell at somebody, strike them in the face, or shout, shake them, you will not do it because, you know, they will not feel well. Harmonizer is very empathic, he's warm, and so on and so on. But he's opposed to a guy called thinker. Thinker is organized, thinker is responsible. If the deadline is to be met, then the deadline is to be met. If it requires me to yell at you, then I will do it because deadline is the most important thing. And there you have it, the first conflict. Then we have a guy called persister. Persister is a great listener. He is thoughtful, he listens to you, and then he makes a decision whether to support you or not. But when he does, the problem begins. Because, you know, what happens to plans? There was this Prussian general, Karl von Clausewitz. He wrote a book about the art of war. And in this book, there's a sentence that says, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So you may plan whatever you wish, but there's your enemy, and then your plans fail. There was another strategist. His name was Mike Tyson, I believe. 20th century strategist. He was once interviewed by a sports journalist about his strategy of boxing. The journalist asked Mike Tyson, what is your plan when you go out to the ring? And Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And this is exactly my thought. So the problem with plans is that they change. The problem with persister is he does not change. If he grabs a solution, he will stick to it until the very, very end, and it's not a good thing. Then you have imaginer. Imaginer is a guy who doesn't speak much during the meetings of all kinds. He's sitting in a corner in his own head, but when he speaks, finally, 2 things can happen. He speaks a solution, and the team says, oh, wow, this is so brilliant, why haven't we thought about it? Or, this is so ridiculous, why would we be thinking about it? And you know what? The problem is the difference between the two is indistinguishable. You don't know what a good solution is until you have tried it. But the problem with imaginer is he lacks passion to support his idea. So he needs help. And he gets this help either from the persister, who will listen to him and say, okay, we will go with this idea, or he gets his help from the promoter. Promoter is very enthusiastic. He can sell you anything. But the problem with him is that he's anything but loyal. He's the guy who changes his mind whenever the wind changes. So the situation is this, okay, we go this. The situation is that, okay, we will go with that solution. So you can't count on him being loyal. And then there's the rebel. Rebel is spontaneous, rebel is creative, he's fun-driven, but he asks the crucial question. He asks the question why. And he's essential to every team, because every research says that the team that starts to agree on things without discussion starts to generate lower quality solutions. So having a rebel, the guy who asks, why are we doing this? Why didn't we come up with another idea? Is very, very important. The problem with rebel is that this is all he lives for. So he needs somebody to, at some point, say, okay, you've made your part heard, now shut up and let us do the work. So these are the six roles, and you can come out with these roles. You can, pretend to be somebody else, but not in the stressful conditions. But when you're in stressful conditions, then you go back to your natural role. And there's another problem with these roles, the one that Color came up with. These people communicate in completely different ways. Because we have 4 basic styles of communication. There are people who are based on facts. When they talk to you, you should pay attention how they ask questions, because they just ask questions. When they go and ask for a certain product or service, they will say, okay, do you have this and that product? But there's people who are communicating using emotions mostly. And when they are asking questions, they first have to explain to you why they ask questions. So they don't go and call MediaMarkt to ask, do you have large TVs? They will say, okay, I'm having a bunch of friends coming over tomorrow and there's a game we want to watch. Do you have large TVs, right? And for some people, this is too much. This communication is too much. But then there's introverted people and extroverted people. I don't have time to delve into the details, but let me just tell you that when it comes to speech patterns, introverts are the ones who speak slower, they speak softer, and they curse less. And the extroverts, they speak louder, they speak faster, and they curse more. It doesn't mean that if you are cursing, you are an extrovert. You can be just rude, right? But extrovert doesn't feel he's cursing because his tolerance for emotions in the conversation is very high. The introvert, if he places a fuck in the conversation, it's a well thought of strategy and he's been preparing for the last 10 minutes, right? So what are the 4 styles? There's the driver. Driver is an extroverted, fact-based, and he's cut to the chase guy. He doesn't like the small talk. He despises small talk. So if you want to try to communicate with him and you invite him for a meeting and then you start a meeting with a, hey, what's up? How are the wife? He will say, cut the crap and tell me why you brought me here. And this is his communication style, right? And then there's expressive. Expressive is natural-born salesman, salesperson. He sells, and let me tell you how he buys first. The expressive buys things that he loves from the people that he loves. And he sells the same way. So he wants you to love him and love the product that he's selling. And if truth is standing in the way, well, we can get rid of the truth. This is the guy who invites you to a dinner and he says, this is the best restaurant in town. Right? Because you need to feel that this is the best restaurant in town. And you know what the problem is? There's a conflict on the cross lines because this guy meets this guy. This is analytical. Analytical lives in numbers. He lives in tables. This is the guy who reads manual instructions for the products before he buys them. And then he goes to the shop and he asks, this TV, does it have HDMI 3 function? And he meets with the expressive who says, this is the top-notch model, it has everything, right? And then this guy says, but on the page 283 of the manual instructions says this doesn't have the HDMI 3. And this guy says, I hate you, right? The same goes in private situations because this guy says, okay, let's go, this is the best restaurant in town. And this guy says, according to whom? And you have a hate from the first sentence. And the last one is called amiable. amiable is the guy who is pretty much like the Harmonizer, because when he's making decision, he's thinking about what other people will think about the decision he's making. His speech pattern is, what do you think I should do? And he comes out as indecisive, but it's not indecisiveness, because he wants to know how you are going to feel with the decision he's going to make. But he lacks the power to send strong signals, because you might feel offended. So when he meets this guy, they do not communicate with one another, because this guy sends, soft signals, and then this guy says, "Why didn't you say anything?" And he said, "I did." But the other guy said, "You didn't." And who is right? Problem is, they are both right, right? And this brings us to another thing called work incompatibility. Back in the 70s, there was a tool developed for General Electric by a psychologist called Hermann. The tool is called HBDI. HBDI stands for Hermann Brain Dominance Instrument. This test determines which part of your brain is dominant when you are making decisions. And this also divides people into 4 categories. I don't know what the psychologists have with 4s, but 4 is a very, handy number when it comes to dividing people. So there are people who are driven by logic. They are logical, analytical, fact-based. They live with numbers. They are people who are control-driven. They are organized, they like procedures, they like following orders, they like plans, they like details, brilliant project managers. But there are people who are people-oriented, they are empathic, they are great negotiators, but they have problems following the plans, right? Because people are not like plans. And there are vision-oriented people. Vision-oriented people are great at seeing the big picture. They use their intuition to synthesize the solution, and there are types of work that are suitable for each kind of person. So there's analytical thinking, and people who think in analytical ways love gathering data, understanding how things work. They assess ideas based on data. Then there's people who love sequential thinking. They like following orders first, but then they are great at planning, organizing work for others, and so on and so on. There are interpersonal thinking people, and they are great negotiators and so on, and they are abstract thinking people who are challenging the status quo. They are creative problem solvers. They see the big picture, and so on and so on. And my question for you is very simple. Which of them is the best leader? Who should lead the team? Nope. Anyone? It can't be just anyone. Okay, you'll be the leader now. Yeah, I think the right answer is it depends. You should learn that by now, right? The answer is always it depends. But okay, you will not pass that easy. Depends on what? Because this idea of fluid leadership it resonates very well with young people. It doesn't resonate well with older people, the previous generation. But since I know that today I'm in charge, tomorrow someone else should be in charge, the main question is, how do I know somebody else should be in charge? And in order to answer this question, I need to introduce you to yet another business idea. This one started its life back in the 60s of the previous century. A book by a guy named Everett Rogers called The Diffusion of Innovation. Rogers came up with a brilliant idea when he was observing American farmers buying different generations of crops, innovative generations of crops. And he noticed that not every farmer is buying in. And he came up with this idea of the product life cycle. He divided the product life cycle into stages. There's the development phase, then introduction to the market phase, then the growth phase, maturity, and the decline. And my question for you is, how did he come up with these lines? Well, thing is, in each of these phases, a different person buys. So he found out that the first person to buy is called innovator. He's enthusiastic towards the market segment technology and so on and so on. He wants to be the first. These are the people who line up back in 2007 to buy the first iPhones. They didn't know what to expect of the technology. normal people who use phones in a normal way would, tap their heads because if you asked somebody back in 2006 what did they want from the phone, innovative phone, they would tell you because they knew exactly. They would tell you, I need the battery to last longer because charging my phone once every 2 weeks is, pretty much irritating. I need bigger keys and I need a clearer voice. And then Apple introduces an iPhone in 2007. The battery lasts 1 day. Calling is an optional function. There are no buttons, but there are apps. And these guys are drooling over apps. Then we have early adopters. Early adopters buy because innovators said so. They are not willing to risk so much, but they still want to be the first. Then we have early majority and late majority, and these people buy from totally different reasons. Again, I don't have time to dwell into this, but this line between early adopters and early majority is a very important line. It has its own book. It's called Crossing the Chasm, introducing innovative product to the mainstream market. And crossing this chasm is very difficult. And then there's the last group. They are called laggards. Laggards are skeptic about technology. These are the guys who today say, my Windows XP fits all my needs. I don't need anything more from my computer. Or can I buy Nokia 3321 back in 2017? So the management styles. There's a guy who connected the two dots you already know. There's a guy who connected HBDI, the ways of thinking, with this process. And let me show you how HBDI works or what it looks like. This is a certain management style. This is a manager who is very much driven by vision, as you can see. He lacks control. He has some people skills, and he has some logics. And according to Peter Robertson, this is the perfect management style for the first phase of the product life cycle. This is the guy who can develop the product because he's driven by vision. So new vision is very important. But then you have to scale up. You have to grow. And this requires another set of skills. This is the perfect manager for this part of the job. So he is still pretty much driven by vision, but as you can see, he also has people skills. You could have developed a product in your garage with 3 people in a team, but you cannot scale up without talking to people. So people skills are very important, but then you need to sell. And sales requires to have control because you need to develop procedures. And you have people skills because you need to manage the large teams of people. And vision comes in the way. So you don't need to have vision. And then you have the retreat. Because every technology comes to an end. And then you've built a factory, you've built a chain of shops, and so on, and you have to let those people go. 300 people that you have hired, you have to let go. I don't know about you, but if I am to fire a person, I am preparing for that emotionally for like 3 days, and then I'm sick for the next day. And it's just one person. And if I was to fire 300 people, some of them are, single mothers, orphans, and so on, I couldn't do it. And there's a name for this management style. It's a psychopath. No, don't laugh. There's huge percentage of high-functioning psychopaths among the managers because they are very good at this part of the job. And this, what takes emotional toll from most people, they do it without a blink. And there's a research for it. But what I am trying to say is that this curve, it challenges you. It throws you challenges along the way. So first you have to design the future. You have to know what's possible. Vision is very essential then. Then you have to grow. Vision plus people is the essential part of this project. Sales, balanced management style, right? Then you have to jump the wave. You have to detach yourself from the product you have created and you say, okay, the numbers indicate that we should stop investing in this product and start developing the next one. And this is a very hard thing to do if you invested emotionally in your product. Then you have to squeeze profits. Again, logic and control. Then you have to creatively roll down the business. And last but not least, with the people who are left after this firing process, you have to inspire them to turn towards a new wave, new technology, and so on and so on. So the lesson I have for you goes against most of the managerial protocols you have read in the books. Because in most of the managerial books, the protocol says that if somebody is good at his or her job, they should be rewarded, they should be promoted, they should be allowed to keep going. But from I'm showing you, the answer is quite the opposite. The reason why a stab in the back happens is that the skills that brought you to this position are A, no longer needed, or B, stand in the way of developing your company, and your teammates see it, and unless you give up power on your own, they will stab you in the back. So my lesson for you is, if they succeed, replace them. And this applies to you too. Thank you very much.